Thank you so much for taking the time to come out on Thursday night, and welcome to our panel on fake news and journalism ethics. My name is Hallie Rose. I'm president of the Global Ethical Leaders Society, which is also known as GELS, here at Case Western Reserve.
And I'm Jack. I'm the vice president of programming for GELS. So what GELS is we're a student group here at Case that is affiliated with the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence. We're a diverse group of students who meet once a week in order to discuss various ethical issues, from artificial intelligence and informed consent to military ethics and end-of-life care. We actually have a couple of GELS members here with us tonight. Could you guys raise your hands, please?
Right, so tonight we are excited to welcome you to our discussion on journalism and media in today's cultural and political climates. At this time, we'd like to introduce you to our special guests. Joining us tonight, we have Vicki Walton-James, who currently serves as senior national editor for NPR News, where she directs more than 40 editorial staff in more than a dozen bureaus throughout the country. As part of her job, she oversees domestic breaking news involving immigration, criminal justice, and national security. Earlier in her career, Vicki worked as the Washington Bureau Chief of Chicago Tribune, where she directed coverage of justice, diplomacy, defense, and the presidency across different Washington institutions.
We are also excited to welcome Jim Sheeler, the Shirley Wormser Professor of Journalism and Media Writing here at Case. He began his career as a news reporter for the Boulder Daily Camera and eventually found himself covering casualties of the Iraq War. In 2006, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for feature writing after a 12,000-word newspaper story called The Final Salute was published in the Rocky Mountain News. This story was later adapted into a book of the same name, which was a finalist for the 2008 National Book Award in Nonfiction.
Now, please join us in welcoming Dr. Catherine Lavelle, who is Case's Ellen and Dixon Long Professor of World Affairs. Dr. Lavelle's research explores the role of multilateralism in world affairs. She's the author of several books and journal publications, and she holds grants from the American Political Science Association, the Hagley Museum and Library, and the West Africa Research Association. Along with being a professor at Case, Dr. Lavelle is a global fellow with the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in its Global Europe program, and she holds a permanent seat on the Council on Foreign Relations.
And last but not least, Dr. Gurma Paris is a visiting assistant professor in political science at Case. In the past, he has served as faculty at the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs, the University of Albany SUNY, and the University of Mannheim. He completed his dissertation at Johns Hopkins University. His research primarily focuses on comparative immigrant integration, race, ethnic relations, and their effects on education. He has presented papers at various American Political Science Association annual meetings.
So thank you all again once for joining us. Later tonight, the floor will be open to questions from the audience, but we do have a few questions to start us off. So first, we'd like to ask, what do you believe is the purpose of journalism? We'll start with Vicki and then go down the line.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to say thank you to the Global Ethical Leaders Society for inviting me here. I'm excited to be here. Thank you, Hallie, for the invitation. I want to take just 1 second to shout out my daughter, Rachel James, Case Western class of 2020. We hope. Kidding. No, it's great to be here, except for the snow, pre-Thanksgiving snow. I'm not a fan. Okay, but on to the question. I'm going to give you a really simple answer about journalism. I'll leave the more complicated answers to the educators here. Journalism is a process of gathering and disseminating information that has at its heart truth. Legitimate journalists, whether they're covering politics or sports or whether they're food writers or whoever we might be, we want to gather information that leads us to the truth and put it out into the world. And I will say that there are a lot of people out there right now who are calling themselves journalists who aren't. There are a lot of ways you can figure out who is and who isn't, who's really a journalist, who's an activist, a provocateur. I'm sure we'll get to that later, so I won't get us off track here. But as you might imagine, journalism is really important to me. I've done it for all of my adult life. I think it's really important to our democracy, and I think we've got a lot to talk about tonight.
It's a huge question. I think I'm going to tell my answer in the form of a story. Kind of one of the scenes that I think probably sticks with me the most throughout my journalism career. One of the most powerful scenes. I was covering the funeral of a Iraq War Marine who was killed in Iraq, and I'd been following his pregnant wife as she was preparing to bury him, and we'd spent a week together. We'd flown to Reno to bury him. We'd been at the airport where she saw his casket come off the plane, and the night before his funeral, she wanted to. She didn't want to leave his side. So in the mortuary, she slept next to his casket the whole night. But we had been following her. Todd Heisler, the photographer, and I had been following her for this whole time, and she had noticed how we were documenting everything that nobody else was seeing. And right before she went to sleep there, the Marines actually brought in a mattress so she could sleep right next to the casket that night. And right before she went to sleep that night, we were kind of in the mortuary in the dark, Todd and I, and she looked up next to the Marine who was guarding his casket, and she said, "Are my reporters still here?" And him, being a big tough Marine, said, "Yeah, do you want me to get rid of them?" And she said, "No, I just want to make sure they're still here." And that really stuck with me, after she went to sleep and we were standing outside next to this really busy street in Reno, next to this mortuary, and there was this big picture window at the mortuary, and you could see inside. You could see Catherine sleeping next to her husband. You could see the war, and I was frustrated. It's one of those moments where you kind of the camera goes from really tight all the way up to, you can see the whole earth, that this is such a huge moment, but yet the cars are rushing by and nobody's stopping to look. And I realized that that's what Catherine said when she asked if we were still there, was that she wants people to look. And I think that when we have that power, we have the power to force people to look into windows that they otherwise either don't want to look into or can't look into. And I think that's a big search for truth is part of that. But it's also a search for why we're here, why we do what makes us who we are.
Yeah, well, thank you for that story, and also I want to thank the organizers for including me in this event. I feel a little bit out of it in that I took a class in journalism in high school, pulling on Miss Tier and St. Joseph Academy, my knowledge, but it was a good one because it really impressed on me at an early age the importance of separating what's going on in the world from editorializing about what's going on in the world. And I think that's a really important thing that we'll talk about tonight. I think if you're a professor in political science, though, as I did actually go on in political science, we use journalism as a dirty word. We'll say, well, that person is just a journalist. They're not a real social scientist. They're not bringing the kind of evidence to bear. And I think many of us would comment on how completely unfair that is, that sometimes there's standards, ethical standards in journalism that we don't always adhere to as researchers in political science. I think it disturbs a lot of us privately. But in a democracy, I would have to point out the incredibly important role that journalism plays by keeping our democratic institutions accountable. And like Jim and I'm sorry, Vicki, I forgot, yeah, commented on the importance of the truth in all of that. So when we talk about a democracy, the most important thing that we talk about is the free marketplace of ideas. That in the free marketplace of ideas, what's going on and what we think about it, these things are all out there, and we let everything out there because eventually we have the idea that the good ideas will drive the bad ideas out. So I know many of you as students, and I always say that, I say some butt-headed thing every day in school, and then I'm brought back home by the reality of what people say, and that wonderful exchange should take place in any democracy. And the danger that lurks is when people are intentionally poisoning that system by putting falsehoods in, just with the intention of destroying the foundations of our democracy. So I think that it's so important what my colleagues are teaching you and doing as journalists, and my colleague Girma's course on media media is so important. And also, it's really important, and I'm really impressed that all of you are interested enough to come tonight, because it really is what keeps all of our democracies functioning and honest.
Thank you for that. Thank you to the organizers for having me here. In terms of the purpose of journalism, I'm going to give, intro to American politics answer. In that journalism connects the governed to the governed. And so it's this idea of searching for the truth in a democracy and providing those that are governed with the information that they can use to keep the governors accountable. In a less democratic system, it's actually used to legitimize the state. So journalism can have these, more positive, truth-searching elements that we think of here or in liberal societies. But in less liberal societies, they're actually an arm of the state used to legitimize whatever practices the state is doing. So depending on the state that you're in, that's going to be the purpose of journalism. So that's kind of how I see journalism, as this kind of on this spectrum of liberal to non-liberal.
Yeah, thank you guys for those definitions. I think it's really great that we have such a broad, different perspectives on journalism. I think we can all agree journalism has been around for a while and it will persist into the future, but at the same time, it is always changing. In a journalism panel recently convened at Harvard University, panelists described the erosion of trust in the media in recent years and what they labeled as the post-truth era. In your opinions, has there been a decrease in trust of the media in recent years? And if so, do you see this trend continuing into the near future?
Okay, sure, I'll start. So it's an interesting time, to say the least, for journalism. We certainly are faced with a crisis in trust right now, and I think there are a lot of different things that come into play there. I think about fake news, and this is a term I'm not crazy about, but I think of it in some different buckets. So there's misinformation, which is just bad information. There's disinformation, which is intentionally false. There are conspiracy theories that usually accuse people who are allegedly evil or awful of doing bizarre things. There's propaganda, which is governments or groups trying to influence people's opinions and decisions. And then there are legitimate news stories that are just termed fake news because someone doesn't like them. And we see a lot of that in Washington every day. And so I think it makes it very hard for people to know what to trust and who to trust. We have a president, and I don't say this to be partisan, we have a president who tells people that journalists are the enemy of the people. He says it fairly regularly. We're fake news, we're disgusting, we're scum. I had a reporter who was covering a Trump rally in Tupelo, Mississippi last week. The president was there supporting the gubernatorial candidate for the Republicans, and he just gestured toward the area where our reporter was sitting and said, look at these people, they're disgusting, they're awful. These are journalists who were there to cover his rally, to report what he was saying, how the crowd was reacting. Instead, they were booed, they were jeered. It's a tough time. Now, some of the people in that rally were later interviewed by our reporter who was there, and they were lovely to her. So I don't know how you square that, the booing and the jeering versus, can I interview? Yeah, sure, come on and talk. We find that when we are, close up and in person with people, they tend to just accept us as people who are trying to do a job, trying to gather information and get it out to the world. But in crowds like that, it's pretty tough, and it feels like nobody trusts you. We have also seen the White House in recent days say they were canceling subscriptions to the New York Times and to the Washington Post, and they're fake news, and we don't need them, and federal agencies should, get rid of them. And, it's a lot. And so I think, sure, we are dealing with some real trust problems for a lot of different reasons, for what people hear from the leaders of this country to what they're dealing with in social media. But I do think as journalists, there are just lots of ways we can show people, show our work, if you will, show people how to trust us. And I'll talk about that later.
I totally agree. I think that's one of the keys is just showing people that we are people, that we're not this, this creature that has been created, that the press or the media, one-on-one, we're the ones next to you in the grocery store, we're the ones at the PTA meeting. Rachel DeSalle, who's like this fantastic reporter here in Cleveland that's been exposing the lead scandal. Her kids are drinking the lead-tainted water. It's we're part of this community. That's why we do what we do, because we care, and it's so frustrating when you see the president or other politicians or whoever just saying that we're making stuff up, we're intentionally getting it wrong, there are no sources. I mean, with almost every story I ever wrote, I would take, you can ask my wife, I would take my notebook and put it under my pillow or under my bed, because I was petrified that I had gotten a fact wrong, and I would wake up in the middle of the night and have to check through my notebook and make sure, did I spell that right? And I would be calling the copy desk at 11 o'clock at night. And I tell my students, when they ask to record something, to say, I'd like to record this because I want to make sure I get everything right, because there's kind of this assumption sometimes that we want to get some stuff wrong, and we don't. I mean, having to write a correction in the newspaper is so humiliating. It's the worst. I mean, you come in with that hangdog look in the the editor's office, and you're like, ah. But we do write corrections, unlike the politicians. We do cop, at least the good ones. Most of us will cop to screwing up, and that's part of the process is correcting it. And we're real people who are just trying not just to do our jobs, but to do everybody's job.
Yeah, I mean, if it makes you feel any better, at least they're reading what you're saying. And when you're a political science professor, we wonder if anybody reads it, so we don't ever have to publish the corrections, because we can just say whatever we want. No one knows. But I think that from looking at it not as a reporter, I think a lot of the trust issue is in the American public's inability to separate who the journalists are from people or entities that are not journalistic. And I think that sometimes we need to do a better job as educators earlier on in educating people in what the sources are and how to evaluate them, and whether or not that is a gate that is a fair gate or is a partisan gate. And I struggle with this because my understanding of, like Gurmit pointed out, not just liberal democracy, but also different countries with political traditions have presses that are openly partisan, or have always been much more openly partisan. And we used to debate that as to whether or not, maybe that would be a good thing, because you pick up a French newspaper and you have a sense of where it's coming from. In the old days in South Africa with apartheid, you knew the Afrikaner paper, the British language paper, and people would go to the other news source to get a reality check on their own experience of whether or not their own reporters were accurate. And sometimes I think more partisanship that is overt might be helpful, and sometimes it's obviously quite destructive. But I think that in terms of getting people aware that when they are watching, what is in the news division on cable or on a network, and what is in the entertainment division, just because the same person might be on these different shows doesn't mean at all that they're playing the same role. And then people such as yourselves get portrayed a certain way when the bad players are out there, but they're not even pretending to be journalists. So I think that has contributed to the erosion of trust, and it's unfortunate, because it's something that's very real.
Yeah, so building on that, there has been in the last 3 years, according to Gallup polls, an uptick in trust in journalism, but it's mostly from the left. And that makes sense because Trump hates the media and your enemy's enemy is your friend, right? But in terms of the foundations of the media, it makes sense why there isn't a lot of trust. We have a standard of objectivity that governs the media. Yet the media has bifurcated into these two different epistemologies in which you have a right ecosystem and a left ecosystem news, and they both claim to be objective. So for the sophisticated reader, they look at all the news and say, that's a sham. Why should I trust it? In order to get any accurate information, I need to survey everything. To the unsophisticated, then they're just left confused if they're trying to learn about an issue, because they'll hear this from one partisan source and this from another, and the whole thing about separating who's a real journalist from those that are just there for clickbait or entertainment, because that market forces have made media have to be more entertaining. So all of that drives or makes media, from a foundational standpoint, a difficult thing to trust, because you're not sure what information is the truth. Or if you need to put together 6 or 7 outlets to get the truth. And because market forces and party polarization sort of push for this partisan entertainment-based media, that makes it very difficult that the media can even establish this kind of trust if we have this kind of liberal media model. So there's some hope that there is increasing trust, but from what I see, it looks more like it's from one side of the political spectrum that sees the media as their friend in this this battle for the heart of the nation. So,
well, there's a lot of confirmation bias, right? There are
Right.
people who will read and watch only things that they agree with, as opposed to really surveying, as you said, kind of survey the landscape and see what's out there. And really be skeptical about what you read, what you watch, what you hear, so that you can figure out what's true and what isn't. I mean, there are ways to do it, and I think as journalists, we're really going to have to work to gain trust of news consumers, and news consumers are really going to have to be rigorous in assessing news sources to figure out what's real and what isn't. I mean, we research before we go buy a car. We research. I mean, we'll get on the internet and research 90 things before we go, buy headphones or whatever. I mean, we've got to be willing to do the work as news consumers to try to figure out what is true and what is not.
Yeah. Well, if I could add one thing.
Yep.
For a generation, though, the right has run against the media. So for some, I don't think they even want to necessarily investigate whether or not, like the New York Times, is truthful. They're the enemy. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of the issue. If one party has run against the media for a generation and has banged this into people's head that these people are the enemy of the state, and now the president's just the latest and probably the most explicit in doing so. But this happened, dating back to William Buckley in the 60s. So I think that's an issue. If one side of the electorate has increasingly thought the media is illegitimate, how do you make the media a transpartisan institution again? And that's really sort of if you want to build trust, you would have to somehow get it there, as opposed to having these two competing ecosystems that don't even speak to each other, that are operating on completely different sets of realities.
Yeah, I believe it was Katie who used the phrase partisan news. You mentioned that kind of in a liberal society, that we can have this partisan news climate. So do you think it is this political polarization that's leading to that partisan news?
Well, yeah, I don't know if it's fair to answer the question with a question, but that's what I was wondering when Gurma was talking. It seems to me that, maybe I'm wrong about this, the partisanship, there is a right-wing media outlet that is directed towards a certain audience. And then there is an entity that is trying to be objective. And the problem is, I don't see a real clear left wing unless I'm missing it. News outlet, I think maybe some people would say MSNBC or something like that is trying to do that. And I just don't see left wingers gravitating towards MSNBC the way I see right wing people gravitating towards Fox News. And that's where sometimes I think maybe if we just threw off and said, hey, you know what, let's just do it. Let's just have partisan news. And then, again, if I want to check on what's going on in the Democratic primary, I'm going to watch Fox News. Yeah. And if someone on Fox News wants to check on what's going on with the impeachment trial, they're going to watch the left-wing news outlet, and we're all going to be above board about where we're coming from. But to answer your question, I don't really know if the cart is driving the horse or the horse is driving the cart. But it's really a problem. I mean, the Huffington Post. I'm just trying to think of where would a liberal go, because I really don't think it's fair to say NPR or, I know we watch the NewsHour. I'm a huge fan of the NewsHour because, as I say repeatedly, I don't know what the reporters think. I can speculate, I can wonder, but I genuinely, at the end of the day, have no idea, or the show, I should say, have no idea where they sit on it, and I love that. That's what I was taught in my little rinky-dink high school class. We were supposed to do. We were supposed to report in such a way that they didn't know if we liked that food in the cafeteria or not, or whatever, weighty matter of the day we were doing. But anyway, I don't know if I'm wrong about that or not. Am I?
I'm not sure that, I guess the way I would see it is, I'm not sure that matters. One side says that you're left wing, and they keep saying you're left wing, so they've run to the right wing, and they just don't trust that side, and they see you as left wing. And there is some evidence, like CNN's moved a little bit to the left. But yeah, you could say that, there's a centrist, center left maybe, mainstream media, and then there's this right-wing media with Breitbart. It's there's nothing on the left like Breitbart. It's true. In terms of readership and extreme political leanings to the right, there's nothing on the left like that. But the right sees you that way. So I'm not sure.
But they're trying. The New York Times is trying to be objective. I don't see that effort. Maybe I'm missing the effort on Fox News. I don't even see the effort. So I guess I'm not. I know it's not you, but because I know that this is what's coming out of the literature and political science, and you're just doing a great job defending it, and I don't have to because I'm in international relations. We can take a swipe all we want. But I look at the New York Times and people say it's liberal, and I really ask myself, is it really that liberal? I'll tell you, my friends don't think they're liberal on some foreign policy issues. There's plenty of there's some countries they say just don't even touch it. It's a certain view of a certain country, and I don't know, because I was raised in this American political culture. We were just talking about this in one of my classes today. I tell them, read the Financial Times, because when I want a reality check, there's snooty British people. I'm sorry, I'm of Irish descent, so and it's a commercial outlet. So if I want a reality check on whether or not it matters that this guy recanted on his memory about quid pro quo, I don't know if that's a big deal or not. But if I look on that app, then I say to myself, the British could care or they don't care, and it gives me a reality check. And that, to me, is not right or left wing. That is an international thing that helps me. I don't know. I honestly, yeah. So you can speak for the defending the news.
Back to the original question and the quest for truth.
We have a president who, has been documented to, it's past 12,000 documented lies or falsehoods at this point. And, and people saying things like alternative truth, or this is not, you're not seeing what you thought you saw. It is a difficult mountain to climb. And I think probably part of the problem is that people are so locked in that there's no room for them to change their mind. Everything has become, just one side or another. And so one of my, I was at a journalism conference recently, and the professor asked, and this was just to journalists even, when was the last time you changed your mind on a major subject? And you have to really kind of sort of think, because all of us are in some ways really entrenched. But there is a quest for the truth, and there are people who are just flat out lying. And I mean, I don't discuss the administration's policies in my class, but I do call out the lies, especially against the press, especially when they're very dangerous. When he's pointing at Katie Tur and saying, "Hey, little Katie," and people are, and if especially, my intro to journalism class has 19 students and 17 of them are women, and if you see some of the vitriol, especially that female reporters are getting these days, it's really scary to see. Yes, you can say you have to have a tough, hide or whatever, but it's scary, and I'm afraid somebody's going to get hurt or worse, because it's just gotten so mean, and people don't see reporters as people sometimes.
One of the really alarming things about these stories that start to circulate that just aren't true, I think we used to look at them and say, nobody would believe that. Come on, nobody would believe that Hillary Clinton is running some trafficking ring out of a pizza joint in D.C. And then a guy drives there from North Carolina and to investigate and brings a rifle and shoots it in that restaurant. And he was tried, convicted, sentenced to 4 years in prison. I don't know if he's still there, but someone could have been killed there, right, because of something that was just fabricated. So I think you're right. A lot of people could get hurt. Journalists, people who are just members of the public, and why? Because someone has made something up and disseminated it through social media. It's been tweeted and retweeted, and suddenly there are people who really believe it, and we are left to deal with that in our society.
We've definitely talked a lot about kind of the state we're at right now and how a lot of times politics, whether we like it or not, can play into that. Also with the advent of the internet and social media, kind of the advent of phrases like untruths, falsehoods, fake news, I think was mentioned, clickbait. How have things like that, how have advances in that way of consuming news changed the way that we approach and interact with media?
There are so many people who just get news through social media, and I don't bash social media. I think it's a great thing to be able to share information freely, as long as the information is true. More information, as long as it's true, is better, I think, for society, and to have easy ways to share it. I think is terrific. The challenge comes when what's out there is false, and there are people who say they only get their news through Facebook, right? I don't read any papers, I don't listen to radio. Facebook is my news source. And, what does that mean for us when we know that some of the stories there aren't true, ads there aren't fact-checked? I mean, there's a lot going on, with the social media platforms right now that's concerning. And so if that's your only source of news, you just have to wonder kind of where that's going to lead us.
Yeah, I think that's, it is a really dangerous time right now. That these, there are people who are gaming the system that know how to. That's what happened. If you read the Mueller report, with the Russian intelligence services, they knew exactly how to play our society against each other and divide it, and it's working, and it's working in other countries now too, which I'm sure you can talk about. It's and some of some of the dictators are taking their scripts, directly from our president, as far as bashing the press, and other intelligence services are learning how to manipulate their own populations that way through social media. So.
Yeah, I think it's so. I'm more willing to bash social media, perhaps, because there is no gate check on whether or not there is a truth element, and what that can do is allow for interference from foreign countries. So we were talking about this, and I said I would give the students adequate credit for bringing this up. When we talk about the ethics of war, what is a cheap way to fight war when you don't have bullets and you don't have an army and you are, let's say, the Russian Empire of what you used to have? A cheap way to undermine your adversary. You want to break down an alliance. You want to have people not believe in democracy. The most inexpensive way to do it is to just go out there and spread lies. And in the Cold War, we know we're up against the same people. There was their truth and our truth about economic systems, about our values, about democracy, about capitalism, communism, and all that. And we had a debate, and maybe we didn't agree on where that debate was gonna end, but we debated the truths. Now there's just a movement to undermine in a democracy the whole idea that such a thing as the truth even exists, and that the success in doing that on the cheap is what angers me, and also it scares me, because as my great students here at Case have pointed out, when we talk about the old style rules of war, you had notions of proportionality, notions of not going out for innocent people. Don't target your attacks on civilians. Keep it to the military. If your war is being fought on social media with the power of ideas coming from Russia or China, as we're starting to see in the upcoming election, if that's where the battlefield is going to be fought, we don't even have an ethical system. Our ethical system was derived from armies on battlefields. It went back to St. Augustine and went back to, how far back? We don't even have the equipment to begin to handle this. And maybe we need to put the brakes on it before we allow it, while we work these norms out and we decide what our values are and how we want these foreign ideas and foreign concepts and lies even coming in, if we want to protect the political institutions that we value.
Yeah, so the internet, I guess, has made news more immediate and participatory and interactive. So 1970s, you had to wait till 7 p.m. to watch Walter Cronkite tell you his news agenda, decided by him and maybe some other upper middle class dude. But the quality of that news was really good, or really high. There wasn't really any competition that news had to play against any other entertainment channels, so you got really good, what they would call hard news. So now you have this wide spectrum of information outlets that you can get, which is great. You can interact with journalists, you can interact with readers, you can talk about what you've read. All this would seem to lend itself to a really great participatory democracy. Unfortunately, there's no gatekeepers. And if you're on social media, the way social media works, it's algorithm-based, so that if you click on something, you're going to get more of that. It encourages networks, so you're generally going to homogenize in your networks and then get the same kind of news, and then you start sharing that news. So this is actually a perfect setting for fake news and all the stuff that you're talking about. So the potential for it to be great is there, but the market incentives and the party polarization that we have that drive sensationalized, really partisan news is also there, which makes it actually really dangerous. So to me, that puts an emphasis or a premium on people having media literacy, but also government stepping in to police fake news, or these social media outlets taking the responsibility and admitting that they're actually public forums and not, we're just here and the information just happens to show up there. They have to take a responsibility too and police this stuff. I mean, this, to me, like fake news definitely violates the actual malice doctrine, which supposedly governs what you can censor in the news, because a fake news site, by definition, or at least these Russian bots, they're meant to undermine the system. That's malice. So the potential is there for it to be great, but the market incentives and the party polarization in combination with the algorithms of social media make it actually a very dangerous thing.
Yeah, I think those are all really great points.
If I could just real quick before we move on, there are a lot of problems with social media. I would be the first to admit that, but there is sometimes a real value in the way governments are using, or our government officials at different levels, state, local, and national, are using it to communicate with citizens. Like if you look at the recent shooting in El Paso, you had the police department tweeting, there's danger in this area, please stay away. As soon as something happens, people turn to Twitter to see what authorities are saying. Now, unfortunately, they're also going to get bad information whenever there's breaking news like that, Pulse nightclub, Sandy Hook, you name it. Somebody is going to tweet something that just is not true. And that's unfortunate, but it's a fact of life now. But also, there are trusted sources of news. There are people who are trying to solve those crimes and get people to safety, who are tweeting and saying, here's the situation as we know it at this moment. Govern yourself this way, right? Take cover or stay away or whatever. And that's something that wasn't happening when I was in newspapers I was in newspapers for 25 years. That wasn't happening then. I think that is a real benefit now. And so for all of the problems that there are with Russian bots and everything else, and there are for sure, I think there are some upsides that serve the public well.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I mean, it's like Black Lives Matter wouldn't exist without the internet. Me Too wouldn't exist without the internet. So it is a form that you can put marginalized concerns onto the public agenda that might not have ever gotten on the public agenda. But so there are positives.
Actually, Vicki, thank you for bringing up that example. I think one thing to note is that regardless of the motives, fake news is still out there, even though it can often come with good intentions. So I think one really important question that we have to ask ourselves is, do you think this is the fault of media companies who are still bound by some sort of journalism code of ethics, or the responsibility of us as individual citizens who are consuming the media to address it ourselves and do the proper fact-checking?
I think we've all got to do a better job of explaining what we're doing and of assessing. So there are lots of things journalists can do. As you were saying earlier, publish corrections. When you goof, say, we goofed, right? Use attribution. Tell your readers, listeners, viewers how you know what you know, who you spoke to, what documents you looked at, what database you built. We can help people understand our process and help them understand, or just help them decide what they think of what we've done. Okay, now I see who you talked to and how you came to these conclusions, and I accept it or I don't, right? And I think as news consumers, we have to say, I'm going to look at that site, cbs15.com.co, like, what is that? And if you're diligent about researching those things, it's easy to tell, it can be easy to tell, what is a legitimate news site and what isn't. And it can also be easy to tell if somebody has done research but eliminated everything that didn't agree with their point of view and just told, one side of the story. But we have to know what to look for, and we have to be willing to take the time to look for it. There are lots of organizations. There's PolitiFact, there's, factcheck.org, there's a kind of newish group called NewsGuard. The University of Missouri and API are doing this thing called Trusting News that people can go to and just say, I want to be an informed news consumer, and there are ways to do that, and I'm going to avail myself of them.
I agree. It's both. The onus is on the journalists and also the audience. The transparency, I think, is key. I think the more transparent we are, the more people understand how a story was reported. And those little boxes of how we reported this story, how we got these facts, if you want to click on the original documents, you can do that now. Those are all really important to earn back trust and tell people, okay, this is how hard it was for me to get this story. These are the 12 people I talked to, somebody, the politician says I don't have sources on, but I talked to this many people. This is how long I spent. I think that's one of the successes of the Daily, the New York Times podcast, is because it's talking to reporters about how they got the story and the people involved in the story and how it's affected them. I think we definitely need more of that. We also need more. My class, I teach media literacy. The basics of the things that you talk about. if there's ever a shooting, people are always tweeting that there's a second shooter. There's almost never a second shooter. You know, people are showing, you know, during the hurricane, there are sharks in the streets. There are never sharks in the streets. And here's how you look at that photo, reverse search that Google image to see where it originally came from, see how it's, and it's just going to get worse with the deep fake video technology. It's going to get worse and scarier as these fakes get more advanced. You know, it's scary, but it's on all of us to trust it. That said, you know, I still get emails from my dad's friends, and you know, we're in their 70s, but you know, those long, everybody's seen those chain emails. You know, it's usually some sort of patriotic thing, and it says this has been checked by Snopes, and of course it hasn't. Right. And you know, so they're trying to game the system that way. And I don't know how you stop those. I continue to reply to them saying I'm a reporter, and I know this is not true, and they still send them to me. So.
Yeah, I'll just be a little bit of the devil's advocate on this one again, because what disturbs me about social media is the equality of the platform that goes out to people. So I'm a professor. Every day professors make mistakes. I guarantee in every class I have made a mistake. No, journalists are not always infallible, but there's a reason why I'm the professor. As fallible as I am, I have a few books under my belt that I can kind of help students navigate certain things. And by the same token, I went to a school where there was a prominent Holocaust denier. Okay, you know, when we would have an event like this, that individual wanted an equal seat at the table to tell people that the Holocaust never happened. We rejected that as a university and as a community, partly because of the cost of the security whenever he would want to come out, but also because in our academic community, we did not accept what he was bringing to bear on our discussion and our debate, because he simply lacked the right background and bona fides to come and talk about the Holocaust. And I defended that then, and I will continue to defend it now. There are reasons. What the four of us say isn't necessarily more valid than what anyone here knows. What these platforms do, though, is give a radical equality to the participants. So when someone such as yourself is talking about the civil war in Syria, you're going out and you are trying to be fair. That, to me, it angers me when the dictator that runs that country puts an editorial out there, and my students read that as if those things are to be weighed equally. And what he is presenting on Twitter or whatever format that is the equivalent of some kid who got gassed. And I don't know how we handle this, but I really would rather see us address it before we become comfortable accepting it as a society, that everyone gets the same vote. We do when we go to the ballot box. There's moments where it's entirely appropriate that we are equal, but there's also moments where we have to be really careful about who we give a platform to. As many times as, like I say, we can certainly be on a platform and be wrong or offer up things that are entirely open to question.
I just wanted to, I think that's so key, and the whole, in class I teach, I'm sure we all teach, that at least in reporting, the false equivalence, you don't, if you're writing a story about climate change, you don't have to quote a climate change denier. The science is set. If you're writing a story about vaccinations, you do not have to give equal weight to the anti-vaxxer. The science is set. But as you say, all you have to do is have one person from those, one of those groups write an entire story that gets the same weight on Facebook as the truth story, and you're in danger.
Yeah, and I know you're not doing it. I know I think it's terrific that I'm leaning more to the reporter side of the table, that you all are open and accepting of the equality of those platforms, because I'm more of a skeptic.
Yeah, building on that, there has been a success in really delegitimizing the institutions that are supposed to produce the hard truth, that are supposed to be transpartisan, like academia, media, science. And they've been successful, at least placing doubt in that. And that makes the whole project of deciphering fake news or labeling fake news difficult. If the umpires are considered captured by the left, then who makes that call? And nowadays you just have like just two ecosystems. One says the science says this, the other says the science is illegitimate. And then if you're not even in these camps, then you're just left, I have no idea. And so I think the task, like what you're saying, is to rehabilitate these transpartisan institutions and make them legitimate somehow, like academia, media, science. I mean, there is some truth that they do lean left. I mean, there are a lot of leftists in academia, and there are a lot of left-leaning people in the media. So it wasn't like the critique was out of nowhere. But the critique has gone to the point where they're not legitimate. So now you just have Facebook where like anybody loud enough that can present an alternative side is just as legitimate as the New York Times, because the New York Times is a left-wing rag. So it's about rehabilitating those transpartisan institutions so that there's some umpire that is legitimate. I mean, like what you said, there used to be a ring, like a circle in which politics happened. People might disagree, but if you went outside of that legitimacy and insulted either the institutions or some norms that everybody had agreed on, you were considered illegitimate and you would be punished. But nowadays, that inside ring has been made illegitimate. So people have just camped outside of it and said, we're operating here. And this is the truth, because all that science, academia stuff is just not legitimate. And a democracy where you have to evaluate officials based on something, you need umpires. And the umpires are not legitimate anymore. And Facebook, you're right. I mean, Facebook creates these communities where you can just pass around stories saying the umpire is not legitimate and tag it with whatever supposed legitimate tag it has, Snope checked or whatever. But that's the problem. You have to rehabilitate those transpartisan institutions, those umpires, so that you can play the political game fairly, I guess. It's like playing a game without umpires,
But Facebook would say they are not an umpire.
Right. I mean, Facebook doesn't want to admit they're a public forum.
Right.
And that's the problem. They are a public forum. They're the number one place where you get news. So
Right, but
that's what they are. But they don't want to be.
No, they want to make money.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
They
And there's a lot of money there.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
So I think the answer is like, one, Facebook has to take responsibility, or the government has to make them take responsibility. But it is on us to be better, to be more media literate. So I would say, like, in secondary school, there should be media literacy classes where you learn how to read the news, sample the news, critique the news, just like how you would learn to type. I don't know if they do that anymore, but they used to do that.
With their thumbs.
I think media literacy is really important. As we started this question talking about whose responsibility is it, and we kind of ran through some of the things that we all should do. One of the really sticky things that we face as journalists is the issue of anonymous sources, because we have stories that require us to grant anonymity to allow people to speak freely. And that is a place where people get really upset. I mean, either you accept a news organization's anonymous sources and their explanation for why they use them, or you don't. But it's hard for us to do our jobs sometimes without using anonymous sources, and I think that is just another place where we kind of get dinged on trust. But I think if we do a good job of explaining why those sources are there and what they offer, it helps news consumers.
And the process, I think. I think, like, when I tell people that, it was our policy at the Rocky Mountain News that if we ever use an anonymous source, it had to be approved by the executive editor.
Yes.
And you had to walk in and you had to argue your point. This is why I need to use an anonymous source. This is why this person needs to be anonymous. The editor usually knows who the person is, but verify that this is the level of government that you're talking to. You still keep that source anonymous, but you have to argue your point. And it's not just like, oh, if you just don't want to tell me your name, that's fine. So
Right. No,
it's
it is,
just that transparency in process.
Yeah, it's a rigorous process. Any reporter who would come to me and say, I'd like to use an anonymous source, I've got to know who they are, why they need anonymity, what is there an agenda there, and there would be a conversation about that. But I think readers and listeners don't necessarily know that. They just think, well, here's somebody whose name is being shielded from me, and I don't know why, and I don't know what to make of them. And we've just got to do better in that way.
Thank you guys for those insights. We definitely appreciate the diversity in response. At this point in time, we'd like to open up the floor to audience questions. So if you do have a question, if you have anything you'd like to ask or run by the panelists, please just raise your hand. Our executive members, Grace and Jonathan in the back, will be running around with microphones. And we ask that when you stand to ask a question, if you could just briefly introduce yourself. So please feel free.
I'm Dave Calavig. I'm an alumni of CASE. And I have a question about how empathy kind of plays into this whole discussion we're talking about. Recently, I've kind of found that when I'm talking to someone new, it isn't until I establish some rapport that I understand who they are, I understand that their feelings are legitimate and their standpoints are real, and then we can have like a real conversation. I'm curious how like that works with journalism in kind of two aspects. How, number one, you work with the subject that you're doing the journalism story on, but then also when you sit down to write the story, you kind of know some people are going to like this and some people really aren't going to like this, and how you sort of empathize with one reader versus the other.
With one reader versus the other. I guess we always try to understand where people are coming from as we're reporting stories, even if that is controversial. NPR some months ago aired an interview with a guy, and I can't remember which group it was with, but he identified as alt-right. This was after, maybe it was the anniversary of the Charlottesville protest, where a man drove a car into a crowd and killed Heather Heyer, who was there protesting. This was an alt-right protest in Virginia. And some listeners said, I don't think you guys did the right thing. We didn't want to hear from that guy. How dare you give him, time on your air? We thought it was really important to explore all sides of that issue. People who were protesting, people who were protesting the original issue, which was the removal of a statue, and then people who opposed those people. I mean, there are many sides to all of these issues, and we seek to understand everybody, and that can get you in trouble with people who don't really want you to explore all sides. I don't know if that's exactly what you're speaking to when you say empathy, but I think of it as just a real willingness to sit down and hear people out and to tell their story.
I spent almost a decade covering the military and military families, and many of them who have wide-ranging beliefs. But when I would go in, I mean, it was usually at the worst time of their lives, mostly because I was covering the effect of the Iraq War that on the families of service members who had been killed. I told them that I was happy to talk about politics if they wanted to, but that wasn't my main goal. And I ended up, as far as empathy goes, I think, in those moments, you're just a human, and they are too, and that's what you're looking for. And I developed relationships with them that definitely, cross all kinds of political lines, and some of them did want to talk about politics, about the war. Some of them didn't, and I've kept in touch with them for until today. Even I don't know if I should read this. I'm just going to read this real quick. I continue to talk to the military families, and recently I went to I had gone to the Women's March in Cleveland, and I just posted a picture of myself there. And a couple of the families like DM'd me and said the equivalent of, I can't believe you would be at that disgusting display of so-and-so. And I just was floored. And so I ended up on Facebook writing a little screed that I think I'm going to read real quickly. I've been fielding some surprisingly divisive comments from a few of my beloved military families for attending the Women's March in Cleveland. My response, yes, I'm a journalist, but I'm also a U.S. citizen, and many of the reasons I marched were the same reasons I was able to earn your trust during the most trying times of your lives. I care about people who have no voice or who are misunderstood. It's why I got into this business. When our new president or his surrogates castigate the media as liars, they threaten to buckle the scaffolding forged by the founders. Sure, there are plenty of meatheads in the media, but there are plenty of meatheads in every facet of life, including the military. I promise you the vast majority of us got into this business to give voice to the voiceless. Just as I promised every family I interviewed for Final Salute and every other story I've written, I may not agree with your politics, but I will be fair. I've cried with you, I've laughed with you, I've sat in the basement in the dark, suffering panic attacks and overwhelmed by the responsibility of telling your stories. The vast majority of journalists are not the elite, we're the ones saddled with overseeing them. Many of the billionaires in the new cabinet make more in yearly bonuses than most journalists make in a year, but what do they actually create? What do they have to show for their work at the end of the day other than a massive paycheck or pushing buttons on a stock trade? I'd love to see if any of the new cabinet members have any of the calluses on their hands from real work that I've felt while shaking the hands of so many of you. Those are the same hands that powered the presses in the basement of the Daily Camera, my first real job where I made $18,000 a year. That didn't matter because at 3 p.m. those pressmen and women fired up the machines and the floor shook because the presses underneath us had just fired up and those words I typed into a computer made an entire building hum. We all came together to produce the equivalent of a novel every single day, one that landed on your doorstep the next morning. Then we woke up the next day and did it again and again. Please remember that next time you hear the media or the press disparaged by one side or the other, the vast majority of us are simply trying to tell true stories. We're not doing it for money or fame, but because we care about you. Please don't fall into the trap of websites claiming something you don't believe is fake news. There is no such thing. There is truth and there is bullshit. I hope the new president is successful because I love this country. I received a handwritten note from General Mattis following the publication of Final Salute thanking me for the story and emphasizing that it was a story Americans needed to read. I hope with all my heart that General Mattis is able to provide a steady, thoughtful hand to this administration, but I refuse to stand by as our new president disparages the institutions forged by the founders to oversee the executive branch, and I will fight until my last breath to continue to tell the stories that must be heard. So, rant over. But the greatest thing about that was actually the families jumping to my defense. All of the people that I had interviewed. One of the gunner guys who were on the rifle salute who they do the rifle salute, and he actually had blood on his glove because he had used the rifle so much, that it had torn, and he had bled onto it. And he gave it to me, and I kept it. And he actually took a picture of his hand and said, "I have those calluses. I know exactly what you're talking about. Do you still have the glove?" And I said yes. And then even better was one of the widows. And this is the last I'll read, but one of the widows said, "Do you need me to kick anyone's ass?" Just throwing that out there. I have a shady side. No, I will never forget the friendship I found in you at the time we spent together while you were trying to tell our story and tell it right. I never had to worry about what I said or censor anything. I was just me hanging out with you. You were such more than just a story writer. You were my confidant. And anyways, she goes on to talk about how important it was to share those stories, and it's so key. I think that when people trust us with stories, we do have to earn them. And to your point, in telling the stories, yes, they hurt sometimes, especially these really emotional stories. they keep you up at night, and they take a part out of you, but they also give something back. So, sorry for the long answer there.
Right.
Hi. If there's anything I learned from your feature writing class, it's that you don't want to be the person that talks after Professor Schiller, so this is disappointing. I'm Henry, senior in the political science department. My question skews more towards the journalism professionals on stage. One of the things that you guys have talked about tonight a lot has been like whose responsibility it is to figure out news and whether it's the recipient or the publication. And my question the whole time has been, I would imagine that for most of your careers before this era, the production of news was about going out and finding the story and finding the truth and the people and writing it and delivering it, and that is still the case. But my question is whether there has been a change in the way news is gathered and developed, especially at an organization like NPR, which is so visible, to reflect the fact that people are now interpreting things more politically, or whether it's still a focus on finding the stories and putting it out there and just letting people do with it what they will.
Well, I think we certainly are. We're covering a lot of ground every day. We've got international bureaus, we've got national bureaus, we've got political teams. We are moving fast and filling a lot of shows with information. And we do want to get the story out there, but we also really want to report it thoroughly. And we want to explain to people as best we can how we did it. And you can't with every story. On news magazines, there's Morning Edition, there's All Things Considered, there's Here and Now, there are several during a day. You can't stop and say, here's a little box that says how we did it all. Sometimes we can, and often we do. But sometimes just within that story, we're using attribution. We know this, this is according to Jim Mattis, or, we're just letting you know where that came from. And we really have to continue to do that. Now, back in the day, at newspapers, I think we were also doing that, but it didn't feel as urgent. I mean, I remember writing obituaries as a 21-year-old clerk at the Kansas City Star, and having my managing editor say, people take obituaries very seriously. They clip them out, they put them in their Bible. You will not make a mistake. You can make 2 mistakes and we'll fire you. We're just not going to have it. We're really serious about it. This is meaningful to people. And so check everything. People will tell you information. You say it back to them. You check it twice. You check it every which way you can, and you make sure when that obituary hits the paper that it's right. And we were serious about it then. We're serious about it now. It's just now there's a lot more fake news that's out there that we weren't really dealing with then. So it feels more urgent.
Yeah, I think one of the big journalism sort of, I don't know if we call it a motto or lesson. If your mother says she loves you, she loves you. What?
Check it out.
If your mother says she loves you, check it out. Make sure you've always got everything straight. Another journalism thing is that they'll say always get the name of the dog. A reporter came back, and the editor, he talked about the story that he was writing, and mentioned a dog in the story, and the editor said, "Do you know the name of the dog?" And he said, "Yeah, here's the name of the dog." And so the editor knew that the reporter was solid. That so always get the name of the dog. If your mother says she loves you, check it out. I'm not sure, Henry, if I deserve more that you're looking for. As far as, I'm not. I guess. Sorry. Can you ask it a little bit differently? The question.
My question was effectively it's moved
was like now that it is in so much of a public conscience that like there is like thought that there is this fake news and that the legitimate news media still has to battle through this to speak to so many people.
Has this been affecting the way that reporters like think and act and report?
Yeah. I think it's. I think there's also the aspect of having to juggle so many things that we weren't doing when we were at newspapers. That you're having to live tweet things. You're having to file several stories a day sometimes. It's just the timely factor. Whereas I was writing 1 to 2 stories a day when I was at a daily newspaper, and now reporters are sometimes writing the equivalent or 7 or 8, or because they do have to, update the Twitter account, do a quick briefing, probably a quick live shot from wherever they are. You would know a lot more about managing all of that than I do right now. But your reporters, I'm sure, are juggling all kinds of balls at the same time.
They are juggling a lot, and at the heart of it all is we've got to gather information and make sure that it's right, because we really, it's going across so many platforms now. Something might be on Up First, which is a podcast for us, and then Morning Edition, and then there's a digital post, and then there's Twitter, and there's, there are all of these different ways that you're getting the information out there, but it has to be right. And so no matter how busy you are or how many, entities you have to feed, you've got to make sure that what you're putting out into the world is accurate. And so it's a lot of responsibility, but I think we're rising to the challenge. And again, if we make a mistake, we'll fess up. We'll say, we got to publish this correction or air this correction. The guy's name was Jim and not Robert, and sorry that we made that mistake, and then keep it moving. But we do have to say, we got it wrong. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name's Hannah. I'm a sophomore here at Case, and the question I wanted to ask you was, what do you think, or how much influence do you think media coverage and public opinion has on public policy and the other way around?
You guys?
Yeah, I know.
You take that one? Yeah, me too.
I know. Well, we always say in political science that we don't really cover, that we don't get the news of the policy. The kind of the politics gets covered, and then sadly, I worked on Capitol Hill for a year as a congressional fellow, and we would lament the lack of coverage of things that were really important. So I worked on the House Committee on Financial Services, and really important legislation came through on Fannie and Freddie, on banking regulation, on all kinds of things. And I think I was acutely aware when I came back here to Cleveland, and I wanted to keep following what was going on that committee, and I realized I had to stop and think about where I was even going to get that information, because it's just not, it is, we cover personalities, we cover scandals. I mean that collectively, because those of us who are consumers of news contribute to this. We have to be willing to pay for this stuff. The whole idea that content is free, I think underpinning a lot of what both Jim and Vicki are talking about are the incredible financial constraints. So I love the example of the obituaries, because we've talked about trust building, and how do you have you had trust building because your grandparents had an obituary. Now in the local Cleveland Plain Dealer, they don't even do obituaries. I mean, of reasonably prominent. I mean, my family certainly wasn't prominent, but there was a reasonable little notice in the paper that when the day they were buried. You felt that connection, and the reporter did get it right, even though you probably fed them a lot of information about grandma's love of bingo. I don't know if they really did check that. But it made you feel connected to the institution. It made other people read it. It just made you a part of it in a way that there's a cold line now on that personal level, but getting to what you're saying, just in terms of getting information about, it drives people in Washington, I know, nuts when people start on Medicare for all. Medicare for all, and these are activists. These are left-wing healthcare advocates who are furious at the way it's being covered, the lack of precision, the lack of the questions that are not being asked of the main people advocating for these policies. policies and what the effect will be on the poorest Americans versus middle income. There's a big discussion about middle income Americans. It's wonderful for those of us who are middle income, but for the most disadvantaged among us, where, how, just like you're saying, how are we getting that kind of information? But I guess from my perspective, it's just, are we willing to pay for it? Or are we just going to say, these local newspapers have closed, because people, they don't want to pay for them. And we still actually get a print newspaper at our house. I wish
3.
I'm pointing at my husband because he actually reads it, and I actually read it online. But yeah, when I was a congressional fellow, there were reporters who were fellows with me, and they didn't get the newspapers they worked for. And so, it's a circle. It extends to all of us.
Yeah, I guess in terms of the media's effect on public policy, I would say the media picks issues that they can sell, and then it will, depending on, at least this is what media theory would tell you, depending on like high-level public political official debate, it picks some angle or some part of the debate and runs with it. And how that resonates with the public would then maybe affect public policy. So if you look at like example I always use in class, like the Iraq War. The Iraq War comes right after 9/11. The political establishment, the left really doesn't want to come across as unpatriotic, so they say nothing. And the media just runs with the Bush administration's take on why we should go to war, even though there's widespread protest outside the country. Because the left doesn't do anything, the media just goes along with the Bush administration, and they get what they want. But say it was something like Vietnam, where by 67, 68, there was high-level debate about whether or not we should be in the war. The media covered it in a particular way, which gave credence or support to those thinking that we should get out. And this had a real effect on public policy. So I would say that it depends on whether or not there's debate, whether or not there's certainty within the policymakers in terms of the policy that they want. If there's uncertainty, and then the media covers it in a particular way, giving evidence or support to one side, then it can really affect public policy. But something like taxes, where it's not sexy, or healthcare, which is complicated, then the media only covers it superficially because that's what it can sell, and then it doesn't have that much effect. So it depends on the policy, whether or not there's high-level debate or certainty, and then the angle the media takes. Like civil rights, for instance, the media played a huge role in civil rights, but in the way that it covered civil rights. But some issues aren't reportable or telegenic or sexy to the public, and then it won't have any effect. But generally, the political elites do kind of govern how the media will cover. They generally cover issues within the realm of legitimate public debate. So wherever the two sides say the debate is, they cover somewhere in the middle.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a different view on that. There were many of us who I think questioned the legitimacy of the Iraq War. Just both sides of the argument there. There are two guys, Jonathan Landay and Warren Strobel, who worked for Knight Ridder, who won many awards for their coverage that was very skeptical of that march to war. So I think there were, maybe not tons, but there certainly were journalists who...
McClatchy, too.
Yeah, exactly. McClatchy did it as well. So there were journalists who took that on. And I think in terms of policy, I don't know. I have never been in a newsroom where we kind of picked what we were going to cover because we thought it was sexy or it was somehow going to make us money. We looked at what was important, what were the biggest issues of the day in the country. And I'll use immigration as one. That is the busiest beat for the national desk, bar none, at NPR. You've got the separation of families at the border. You've had a travel ban and, changes with asylum and just all kinds of policy on immigration over the last few years, and our desk, our immigration team, has really examined those policies and the way they affect the lives of real people on both sides of the border. I don't know if that makes us money or not, but I mean, we think it's a big issue in this country, and we pour a lot of resources into it. And there are several other beats I could name that are that way. We look at policy and, policy that's made in Washington and what it means writ large in this country, and we do it based on what we think is important.
If I could just ask one more time, could you raise your hand if you want to ask a question? Could I ask real quick if JELS members could just hold your questions for a moment and let the community members ask, and you'll have a chance right after. Yes. Or I think we have 2 more questions. So we'll have time for these 2 more questions, and then we will be wrapping it up.
Okay. Hi, I'm Fiona. I'm a sophomore. And I recently watched a documentary on Cambridge Analytica and their role on specifically targeting people with fake news who are easily swayed, or the group of persuadables. So how do you specifically think that fake news has contributed in our elections and our politics in general? And how do you think fake news will affect us in the future? In that realm, specifically.
You want to go first this time?
I'm
not trying to hog up all the airtime here.
I think we talked about it. Well, it's been proven how that it did affect, that there was an influence in the last election, and I think they're just getting smarter about it. Not just the Cambridge Analytica types, but the foreign governments who, once again, are just pitting us against each other, trying to rip the country apart from the inside, and we're playing along pretty well. They create sites for both sides of the issues, and then populate those with comments from bots and start the argument, and we jump in and we argue. So there is a responsibility to try and weed those out by those corporations like Facebook, I don't know how you figure that they can figure out how whatever the last time I looked for a pair of jeans on the internet and put that ad next to whatever I'm doing, why can't they somehow code what the fake news is? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, if I can offer a little hope here, I guess the wonderful thing about old age is that you realize how fast these things change, too. So I always like to remind people that we had whiteboards when I was in college, and we'd actually have to say, meet me at the cafeteria at 2:15 or whatever, because that was how we got in touch with each other. We didn't have texting and whatnot. I'll say to people, do you know what Alta Vista is? Well, Alta Vista was a search engine we thought was hot before we knew what Google was, And everybody used Alta Vista, and then next thing was Google. And I understand, I mean, people tell me Facebook is out, then Reddit was in, and Reddit, I'm not even hip to this stuff, I can't work it. And so I would suspect, and I'm sure Germa knows a lot more about, that would break down by a certain part of the electorate that would be much more susceptible, who are a certain age group, a certain demographic, who are actually able to use their iPhone successfully. They know how to work Twitter, which I also don't know how to work. So I think that it might be that, and also I think the speed of change, that we were all a little, what do I want to say, gobsmacked by the last election, by just the fact that it hit us with this, fire hose. And I think that now many of us are a little more savvy, and I think we will be able to get the kind of algorithms and whatnot. I still have enough faith and confidence in the American people, at least, that we will be able to, there will be people who want to defend values and all the rest, and we'll come up with the technology for it. And I probably won't be able to work that technology either, but I think that I would just remind people how new all of this is, and that it's really, I mean, I remember being here at Case without an iPhone. I mean, it's new, and so it will, whatever you can count on is that it will change by the time, if you're a freshman, by the time you graduate, it's going to be a totally different picture.
Was the question whether or not it had an effect on 2016 election? That was the question, right?
No, it wasn't whether it did. It was how do you think fake news will affect our future of politics?
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I don't feel so hopeful. Just with the prevalence of getting news off of social media, and because it's so algorithm driven, and the homogenous communities it creates, and just the natural sorting we have in the electorate residentially, and then on Facebook, it just is such a great context for fake news. So I really believe it's on the electorate to become more media savvy, and on these Facebooks and these other social media sites to police this stuff. So yeah, I do think that it will have an effect. Maybe it won't have the same effect as 2016 because it was so new. But I still think that there is a problem with gatekeeping and creating quality news. And then there's the whole problem with that, the two camps operating on two different epistemologies. They think the reality is completely different, and that lends itself to fake news. So, and that doesn't seem to be going anywhere. So in that sense, I feel not so hopeful. I'm sorry. So I do think it will have an effect. The last election was really decided by a coin flip in 3 states. So in that sense, fake news can be the tipping point. If the election is not as close, maybe it won't have that same effect. But I still think that it's a real problem that no one's really Facebook and these sites have only just started to address it. And the other contextual stuff that I talked about is only getting worse. So
yeah, one of the tenets of journalism is to speak truth to power, but you can't do that if the power doesn't believe in truth. So
yeah, we can't agree on I've had people say even the fact checkers are captured. So if no one believes in the refs, it's like playing a game where everybody's cheating. You ever play if you play basketball and the guy's cheating, he's like, it's a foul every time he misses a basket. I'm not sure how you play that game.
But if you can develop blockchain technology to kind of address some of the the initial problems with people being able to hack into account. This is what I'm not into this, but that you just didn't even have that you set up the initial internet systems and everything is hackable, but you could actually go back because it was not designed with the idea that this was going to be the outcome. But now that we know this is the outcome, there may have to be a process of going back and redesigning these systems so that my understanding of blockchain is that the users police each other. And so you would have to really think back and do that. But I do think there are minds out there. It's just that I never heard of Facebook until whenever. I had a student tell me what it was. I had to have somebody show me on one of these consoles, and that was when we were just getting the consoles in the classroom. And now it's so. I think there's space in the tech sphere for people who want to create a space that would have some of these mechanisms. It's strange for me to be the optimist, I admit. Yeah, you're right about that. I'll give you that. I'm never the optimist.
On my Facebook feed daily, I see strange posts because I come from kind of a small town, and I never respond because for me it's just a sociological study. But it's just every day. Today I got one that Obama was an evil president. Evil. And he went through a list of things that he did was evil. It's just, you don't have to like him, but it's just kind of strange. But I see this stuff all the time. It doesn't seem to be going away.
It doesn't seem, I agree. It doesn't seem to be going away. And, I saw this story the other day. It actually appeared first in April, but for some reason I saw it the other day, and it said Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has put forward a ban on motorcycles. And the commenters were upset, how dare she ban motorcycles? And it's just come on. At some point we're going to have to use common sense, right? At some point you're just going to have to say, did she really? How do they know that? Where's the bill?
But the thing is, most people aren't that politically sophisticated.
But I think we have to move to the point where if something outrages you, if you say, I just can't believe that, well, maybe you shouldn't. Check it out.
We are just about at 9 o'clock right now, so we're just going to allow time for one more quick question. If you could direct it to a specific panelist, that would be more ideal.
I don't know, somebody. Mine's kind of in the same vein. I don't know, maybe one of, what do y'all do? Poli-sci. Maybe one of the political science people can help me out with this, but I'm in a lot of Sheeler's classes. We talk a lot about journalism. And one of the things that we hear the most when I ask questions and when we're discussing is how vast of a change that we're going through right now. And I was always wondering if it's really that much of a change or if it just feels so sudden now that we're in it right now. And I was wondering if you could give any more context. Oh, you know about international stuff. Do you have you seen, is it really that startling that this is happening, or have we seen this before? And do you think that the trends that have happened elsewhere and the trends that have happened with other media platforms will continue on with us, or do you think that the cultures are too vastly different to have some translation?
Yeah, it's definitely changed and fast and international. I mean, the wonderful thing is that, I went to Northwestern, we were saying before, and Northwestern's famous for its Africana Library. The Africana Library, the newspapers would come every 2 weeks, and we could actually read African newspapers. That was huge when I was in graduate school. Now, anyone can just go on their iPhone and read, what's going on in Tanzania, read the actual newspaper, the Daily Express or whatever. You could pull that up on the internet, and that's amazing to me. And that is a fundamental real-time difference kind of a thing. And so, yeah, I think the speed of it, like I'm saying, the fact that I don't know how long Facebook is going to be a popular app. I mean, maybe I'm totally off, and you should never, as a social scientist, do research by asking people like you. So asking students is just younger versions of me, because I was a political science student. So, when they tell me Facebook's not cool and people your age don't do Facebook anymore, I just believe them. But maybe I'm wrong, and maybe a lot of people are really getting all of their news on Facebook. But it's certainly the new apps that appear and the different sources where people get their news from. I think that it just, I see the pace of change as being just incredibly fast.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. So if we could get one more round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.